Donc l'IEARN, l'Indian European Advanced Research Network, a été créé il y a maintenant plus de 10 ans, en 2007, à l'initiative de Sunil Kilnani, qui est le directeur du King's Indian Institute au King's College à Londres, et du Wissenschafts College à Berlin, qui est l'équivalent de l'Institut d'études avancées de ce côté-là de la frontière. Depuis maintenant 2014, c'est l'Institut d'études avancées de Nantes qui est l'administrateur du réseau et qui tire profit des fonds généreux de c'est un peu difficile à prononcer, Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, qui est une fondation suédoise privée et qui a pour mission de financer la recherche en sciences humaines et sociales. Et donc le réseau a plus particulièrement pour mission de regrouper un ensemble d'institutions de manière assez lâche, qu'elles soient européennes ou indiennes, et de favoriser non pas des projets de recherche en tant que tels, mais leur mise en lien de chercheurs sur des projets, ce qu'on appelle focus area, et afin de leur permettre de discuter, de dialoguer entre les continents et sur des questions qu'ils jugent eux-mêmes pertinentes et qui sont validées par le steering committee, le comité de direction du réseau. Et l'intérêt, c'est de poser les bonnes questions aux problèmes communs qui se posent ici et ailleurs, et d'essayer d'évaluer à la fois ce qui rassemble les continents, ce qui les distingue, ce qui est en propre chez les uns et les autres, afin de donner une meilleure image du monde d'aujourd'hui et d'envisager l'avenir aussi également. Depuis sa création, l'IEARN a accueilli presque 10 focus areas. Les 5 premiers viennent d'arriver à échéance. Ils ont porté sur des thématiques assez diverses, que ce soit le droit constitutionnel, l'histoire des sciences, l'histoire des musées, et notamment des choses qui ne sont pas mises en valeur dans les musées. Donc c'était tout un intérêt d'aller voir au fond des musées, derrière les portes cachées, etc. Et puis un ensemble d'autres questions relatives à la politique, aux questions politiques contemporaines, la démocratie et puis le fédéralisme. Voilà. Et depuis cette année, nous avons la chance de pouvoir ouvrir 3 nouveaux focus areas. Un 4e est en discussion sur les arts et le symbolisme. Et les 3 nouveaux focus areas ont pour tâche d'essayer de comprendre le droit et la distribution, la question de la justice distributive en Inde et en Europe, et également aussi l'histoire des archives en tant que telles, et bien évidemment la question de la confiance dans les relations commerciales, qui est portée aujourd'hui par Lakshmi Subramanian et puis monsieur Yannick Lemarchand. Voilà. Il y a un site internet qui résume un peu toutes ces choses-là. Et donc c'est aussi l'occasion pour moi de vous annoncer que, puisque vous êtes ici, c'est l'Institut a ouvert a lancé sa nouvelle appel à candidature pour 2019-2020. Et si vous souhaitez consulter le site internet de l'IEA, vous trouverez toutes les conditions pour candidater, etc. Voilà. J'espère que vous aurez bon séjour ici lors du séminaire et de cette conférence qui nous a l'air passionnante. Voilà.
Merci. Je vais présenter en anglais parce que je ne suis pas confiant avec mon français. I will introduce my friend and colleague Maria Fusaro, who is the director of the Center for Maritime Historical Studies and professor of history at the University of Exeter in the UK. I believe that what she will speak of today will sort of set the bar for the conference that is to follow. Maria's very broad interest, I think, would be the economic and social history of the early modern period in Europe. She has a specific interest in the history of Italy, especially the Venetian Republic and the Mediterranean. She's interested in the role of commercial networks in the era of the first globalization. She's published very, very extensively. Her book, I think, The Political Economies of Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean, reflects many of these concerns. I've been personally very interested in the way she looks at methodology and in busting national historiography. So I'm very, very pleased to have Maria with us. For the last 5 years, Maria has been working on an ERC, the European Research Council, consolidated grant titled Average Transaction Costs and Risk Management. I know it sounds terribly economist, but believe me, this is really fascinating work because the team has really put together work on a legal instrument, the general average, that helps distribute transaction costs across players and plays this very important role in energizing commercial networks. So I'm really hoping to hear about this in today's address as well, because I think in recent years we've had some very interesting scholarship emerging on the role of law in economic life. And of course, it then sets the question of how do we look at law and trust? Do we see this as a continuum? Do we see this as binary? So I think there's a lot for us to learn from this particular address. So welcome, Maria. The floor is yours.
First of all, I would like to thank Lakshmi for inviting me here with Yannick and the whole Indian and European Advanced Research Network. Of course, I also would like to thank our hosts here in this wonderful place that I've seen for the first time today, but about which I only heard magnificent things, from the intellectual to the personal to the logistic. So it's always nice to be in places such as this one that properly allow us to think, which is something that academic life allows us less and less. I'm not sure whether I'm gonna satisfy the traditionally high bar that Lakshmi has put in introducing me. But certainly the considerations that form the core of my talk today have been emerging from 3 ERC projects, in fact, that I've been lucky and privileged to be part of. One which was my own, dedicated to comparative studies of maritime employment between the late Middle Ages and the early modern period across Europe. Another one where I was an invited scholar, which is based in Paris, and it's still active under the direction of Wolfgang Kaiser, which is called Mediterranean Reconfiguration. And the third one, which mercifully I started only 5 months ago and not 5 years ago, as Lakshmi was saying, which is the one about average. And all I can say is that I look forward to the moment where I shall be free from the administrative nightmare of setting up a large European Research Council project in times of Brexit. I shall stop because my next statement can only be tears. And I was taught not to cry in public, if possible. So what happened? The research, the methodological challenges, the questions about properly going about transnational history, entangled histories in some other denomination, at the basis of what I will say today. I'm delighted for questions, criticism and suggestions on how to move forward, because on some of the points that I shall raise, I don't have an answer. I have lots of questions, and I'm really looking forward to today and this workshop itself to see whether we can all help each other to move forward. A few years ago, I accepted an invitation to write a paper about the relationship between maritime and global history. And I acceptedly, breezily, without quite realizing what an important role in my own intellectual thinking this paper had. So the thing that I can say to the younger people in the audience is be very careful when they invite you to write about something, because the consequences are big. I researched the topic, and at that point what came very clearly as a central point was something that was stated by Jan de Vries in one of his essays about global history. And the fact that the fundamental confusion attached to the globalization concept derives from its simultaneous definition as a process and as an outcome. But the other thing that struck me was how much the literature was absolutely dominated by the economic element. Clear evidence of the strength of both economics and, frankly, a bit economic history, but mostly economics, in defining the agenda for global history. And as it frequently happens to me, and I'm wondering whether it's just an intellectual side effect of living my intellectual life in foreign languages, I've become obsessed with definitions. And I realized that global history was ill-defined, and a major confusion for me stemmed from the analytical overlapping of the concepts of global history and word history. And in my mind, there were substantial differences in the way in which these two disciplines, sub-disciplines, were working together. So I provided my own definitions. And one of the things I'm going to do today is possibly question my own definitions. But at that time, I defined word history as mainly concerned with a critique of Eurocentrism and its elegant twin, Orientalism, so firmly connected with social and cultural history, whilst global history was substantially less critical in its approach to the history of the West, in lots of inverted commas, and was closely tied with economic history, which, by the way, is very acritical in relation to global history. Global history, for me, engages in the evolution over time of global processes, whose development was and is influenced by a high level of interconnectivity. And I listed some: trade, migration patterns, growth and control of population, agriculture, urbanization, disease, technology. So, global history for me investigates the impact of increased connectivity. Word history concentrates on common patterns of historical development. And I'm sorry if I was starting by quoting myself so much, but over the last few years I realized that there is a massive hole in these definitions I provided, and the hole is legal history. So, what I would like to talk for the rest of my time today is where legal history sits in these divisions. I think it can sit in both global and word. But for me, the history of the law is intimately connected with increased connectivity. And so I shall try and look at it through the lens of global history. Legal history can truly connect the economic, the social, the political, and the cultural side of analysis on a global scale. In its manifold incarnations, plural, law is, in the wording of the concept paper of this workshop, a most concrete tool and device to handle trust, amongst many other things. And in this attempt at figuring out the role of legal history within global history, it occurred to me that there was another massive hole, particularly in the Anglophone bibliography, and that was the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean apparently is not involved in global history. There's been quite a few new manifestos about the new Mediterranean history, and I personally have problems with area studies, but maybe we should talk about them in the next couple of days if these emerge. But lots of things are listed. I'm quoting John Watkins here. Political, social, and aesthetic consequences of globalization, empire, migrations into, within, and from the Mediterranean, trade and the movement of capital, piracy, captivity, slavery, cultural diffusion, religious conflict and assimilation, environment, scarcity technology, diplomacy, gender, cultural hybridity, modernization. No legal element at all. Although we can argue that a legal framework underpinned just about all of the above. This absence, again, in Anglo-American historiography, of such a conceptualization is particularly odd, given that over the last 10 years, the explosion of the legal interpretation of Mediterranean history has been possibly its most fruitful area of publication in many languages, amongst which in English as well. And in English, I'm thinking of the very recent work of Joshua White or Jessica Marglin. I'm thinking of the whole team of Config Med that is published in several languages. And the problem, I suppose, is in a sense the fact that the Mediterranean is, as was defined to me by a very eminent scholar that shall remain nameless, at least for the time being, is a small sea with a big historiography. Well, the thing is that avoiding dealing with the Mediterranean is normally presented as avoiding Eurocentrism. And I would like to argue instead that we should go back to the Mediterranean and take the Mediterranean back into account, exactly to counteract Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. It's normally, how can I put it, the northern shores of the continent, which are at the center, more than its entirety. It's also interesting to note that if we take even the economic angle of global history, some of the cultures, empires on the shores of the Mediterranean have been the first European victims of globalizing processes. Venice is a banal example to make in this environment, with the absolute wave of shock of the discovery of the Atlantic Indian Ocean direct route to the spice trade. But Venice is not the only one. The Mediterranean is normally raised as a topic, and a lot of literature claimed its uniqueness stands in its interconnectedness as a region. David Abulafia, in the last page of his big Mediterranean opus, The Great Sea, calls it the most vigorous place of interaction between different societies on the face of the planet. It's also a small space. And what is interesting about an interconnected small space with a legal history perspective is how it can become a very good area where to examine how the clashes and overlapping of powers and jurisdictions, particularly, but not exclusively, within the maritime world, ended up shaping international relations during the early modern period on the global scale, not exclusively in that region. My project on maritime employment was firmly focusing on seamen as the first global profession. And maritime employment and its litigation within the Mediterranean had a transformative effect in defining those employment laws which would later support the Industrial Revolution and, frankly, structure the Anglo-American version of capitalism, which ended up dominating the planet. There's a book coming on these issues, hopefully next year. And I suppose it will absolutely make me unemployable in the Anglo-American word. But the concept of global history, therefore, needs to be framed in both wider and at the same time more analytically precise terms than it is today. A few years ago, in a very sharp essay, Regina Grafe forcefully argued that even assuming the economic interpretative flame, more needs to be done to overcome the dominance of price and wage convergence as the standard benchmark of globalizing processes. And frankly, for maritime histories in particular, to go beyond a view which sees in technological advance the deus ex machina of historical development. What I would like to argue, and I appreciate that this is provocative, is that the first form of globalization was not economic, was legal. And the expansion, the aggressive expansion of European laws, in inverted commas again, I include common customs as well into this, was firmly embedded into this phenomenon from its very beginning, substantially predating any form of economic globalization, whether we take it in qualitative terms. I've argued for the functioning of the Manila galleon as the qualitative benchmark, or price-wage convergence, 1820s really, not before. In the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Europeans did not encounter local powers with recognizable sovereignty claims over extensive and deep waters. In the Indian Ocean, they did. But in actual truth, superior naval power allowed them to shape negotiation with local authorities, we can say other words as well, thus allowing Europeans effectively to overrule, when not downright ignore, whatever claims they were. An awful lot of the literature which deals with these issues concentrates on the military aspect of it, on the weaponized aspect. It can be proper navies, it can be piratical activities, it can be corsairing activities of some forms. But it narrates a story which I think is very limited, but which sees this fight for sovereignty as a game played internally between European states on the neutral words of the oceans. But even this literature would be forced to admit that this type of game cannot be played in the Mediterranean. Local, established, and competing jurisdictions could not be quite crushed or simply ignored. Now, I'm not arguing that the jurisdictional politics of the Mediterranean were unique. This has been argued in the past quite a lot. But comparable situation is being uncovered now by what I find very exciting new analysis that deal with maritime East Asia, Indian Ocean, South China Sea, I'm thinking of Tonio Andragi, I'm thinking of Hein Hung, thinking of Lakshmi. The importance of the Mediterranean lays not just in how jurisdictional interaction somewhat prefigured what happened later in the rest of the world, but the fact that these competing jurisdictional claims stemmed from a legal culture which was common to all parties. The result of this was that claims were framed in a shared language, epistemological language, which posited and took for granted an essential agreement on the nature and essence of jurisdiction. Thus, all these agreements required long and painstaking negotiations. So this fight for global supremacy was not only done with weapons, cannons, fancy ships, and sail designs, but with the law. Every day, in the civil courts around the Mediterranean. The fight for European supremacy within Europe, which continued and continues today, especially as fought in the early modern period over Mediterranean waters, although frankly one can argue, unfortunately, that about today as well, was fought daily with the grinds and maneuvers in negotiation in innumerable courts of law across the continent. Seamen are fantastic to follow because they move and they argue and they litigate everywhere in the Mediterranean. So my early project allowed me to discuss how the comparative analysis of the legislative framework of maritime employment provides plenty of food for thought, not just about states' different approaches to labor, which in itself is monumental, but also about the shifting balance of European states' hegemony. And this was formative for Europe and for this funny thing called the West. They're not synonyms, by the way. And they ended up having consequences across the globe. In the 16th and 17th century, before the nation-state, before the implementation of properly national commercial strategies, the intermingling of nationalities, ethnicities, commercial interest, private interest, public interest in the Mediterranean was substantially higher than in the 18th and 19th century. And it was a situation which has interesting resonances with the present condition of international maritime trade, which is, as we speak, experiencing a profound structural, legislative, and governance changes, which in partly are due to technology, no doubt about that. In the 17th century, that had to do, of course, with new constructions. Today, still trying to legislate around containerization. But also by the entrance of new shipping nations. In the 16th and 17th century, the English and the Dutch. Today, the Chinese. One of the things that transnational history constantly tries to define, and hasn't yet, and I think it's a very important topic worth of discussion, is how to define the role of states. Lakshmi introduces me as someone that has been discussing about the power of national historiographies and particularly national mythologies, in fact. But states are still fundamental actors on the global state. In fact, far more today than even a couple of years ago, I dare say. What is happening, though, is that in a sense, for this particular issue to do with maritime trade and legislation, we're at the opposite side of the circle. The 17th century states were desperately expanding their jurisdiction on their subjects, those wily creatures. And today, there's been a loosening that now, in very recent times, is instead reined in. The interaction of the supranational and the national level of action within the law, but also within the economies, is possibly the most stimulating and controversial field of both political and legal activity. I'm not talking history now, alas. Why was the Mediterranean neglected? Small sea, big historiography, massive historiography, but many roots as well. A sense that the early modern Mediterranean was an area of decline, and it's not worth studying decline. There's some sort of a Whiggish approach, alas, which has spread from the islands onto the rest of Anglophone historiography, in which studying ascent is far more analytically valid than studying decline. Us Europeans, frankly, should stop and think about that. Because in truth, throughout the centuries, and I'm talking about the early modern centuries, the Mediterranean never lost its centrality in the political and military strategies of all European nations. Even those with primarily an Atlantic seafront were seriously engaged into it. France is an example, a very peculiar example, but throughout the 18th and 19th century, the second largest British fleet was in the Mediterranean, not in the Indian Ocean, or indeed in the Atlantic. But the problem is that in contemporary scholarship, the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean are the primary loci of globalization, are the primary loci of modernity, whatever that is. That's another workshop. I'm thinking of classic text constantly given to students, David Armitage, Paul Gilroy. But there's a big problem in this. I have a distinct feeling that globalization is sometimes considered as something that happens in faraway places. And by the way, far away in relation to Europe, of course. Which brings us back straight to the Eurocentrism mentioned earlier, in what I find a very frighteningly embedded and structural way. Globalization is something established through connection between faraway places in relation to each other. And by own intrinsic nature, it's a phenomenon that affects the global scale. That is to say, Jakarta as much as Nantes, Exeter as much as Kolkata. So this subconscious, probably, streak within the scholarship has become globalization is what happens away from Europe, or it is what Europeans did in faraway places. Hence, the Mediterranean is out. Now, this approach, I think, is Orientalism in practice. The problem is that the Mediterranean was not unique because of its interconnectivity. It was maybe unique in the poly-sided comparative developments of these different laws, legal cultures that shared a common language. And this is a very globalizing phenomenon that can be easily studied with a global lens. The administration of justice all over the world is a fundamental prerogative of power. European state expansion was the expansion of their legal systems. From the late medieval, universal and global religious and jurisdictional ambitions, Treaty of Tordesillas, anyone? 1494, possibly the text which was most politically interpreted and misinterpreted across the centuries, to the legal ceremonies of possessions, which characterize European practices of claiming sovereignty. The interconnectivity of the Mediterranean sets the stage. That's what it does, nothing else. Active and competing jurisdiction, frequently contested, sometimes shared, sometimes silently, mutually ignoring each other. And this makes it difficult. In the rest of the globe, Europeans could and did ignore local powers, could and did pretend not to understand, or in some cases, genuinely not understand what was being said. On land, it's easier. The constant movement of ships and seafarers is another peculiarity, which makes it more difficult to manage legal conflict. But all players in the Mediterranean were discussing expansion and extension. In actual practice, effective reach of their own jurisdictions, not their existence or validity. And this common legal culture and language is what allowed such a profound intermingling. Maritime history is full of mythologies, possibly even more than national histories. But one of these mythologies is that people of the sea always understand each other. There's no differences. We speak a common language. We have a common practice of operational overlapping that allows us to talk to each other. But you see, when a Dutch or an English seaman brought his litigation in front of an Italian or a French court of justice in the 17th century, the laws that they used to argue their own rights and duties, in practical terms, their access to wages, was the product of a different society from theirs. And assuming, in line with the unifying literature on lex mercatoria and lex maritima, that maritime legislation existed in an independent sphere, shaped by universal conventions, which made it the same across the continent, possibly straight out of Plato's cave, then going to court in Venice, Marseille, Genoa, as opposed to London or Amsterdam, should have yielded the same outcome. Yet, this was clearly not the case. And the evidence points to substantial structural differences and real difference in outcome, depending on where access to justice was sought. So for me, studying the strategies employed by seafarers, by the way, I shall remind everyone that seafarers are normally considered and defined as ignorant drunkard louts, barely capable of signing their own name. Within the Mediterranean, they could choose between multiple fora, and this happened only in Europe. When I originally conceived of that project, my primary concern was to evaluate whether and how different traditions of contractual law gave a comparative advantage to Northern European economies in their penetration of the Mediterranean commercial zone. This was and still is a very topical issue. Contemporary scholars debate is incredibly active on quantifiable effect that legal rules and their enforcement have on economic and financial development. I'm aware it's dangerous to evoke contemporary elements, but also I think it's important to keep an eye at continuity over the long term, present-day relevance. And in fact, what struck me throughout the project, and I so much wish I'm wrong in what I'm going to say, and if any of you has got evidence to the contrary, please make me a happy scholar and tell me. This type of civil litigation in the early modern period was almost impossible to pursue outside of Europe. For an English seaman active around the Indian Ocean, justice needed to be pursued through national representative channels, either involving one's own country consular authorities, I'm looking at Arnaud, or with local representative of trading companies. The alternative was to wait to be back on home soil. Local legal systems were not accessible to European seamen, nor I've ever found any evidence of attempts at accessing them. And here, the Mediterranean is different, because local courts were constantly sought, and justice was constantly attempted to access, bypassing one's own national authorities. Config Meg, a very Mediterranean project, is not a maritime project, but some of these issues are encountered by scholars in its networks daily. And the interpretive framework of Config Meg is particularly relevant if one tries to discuss the entanglement of legal and economic history. Because its main goal, which I think is succeeding very well, and here I have to admit that I have the advantage of actually having read the drafts of most of the monographs that will come out over the next couple of years, so I've got insider trading knowledge. The goal of the project was to overcome the model of the institutional and territorial integration of the region as a consequence of the mere diffusion of European institutional models. So, avoiding the traditional paradigm of the linear Europeanization of the region. And what Config Med is bringing to the fore on the global scale is something relevant for what I'm trying to say today. The three legal systems, legal structures that end up dominating the globe with utter and unquestionable hegemony: civil, common, and Islamic law, had in the Mediterranean their most active interactions since the invasion of the Northerners in the last quarter of the 16th century introduced common law. It's the place where the three systems daily talked. Let me make a little odd aside, whose sense I hope becomes evident later. The CIA, that wondrous research organization, one never thinks of the CIA as a research institute, it is in fact, publishes a word fact book, whose reading I recommend to anyone who wants to be scared and intrigued by it. And within it publishes not a list of states, but of administrative divisions in the US government category, providing details about the legal system that they use. To my knowledge, is the only source that provides a snapshot of contemporary legal systems. It's not the place to discuss the methodology or the reasons behind the partitions or the choice or the words or the political agenda behind this interesting exercise. It gives some good stats. Out of a global of 254 administrative divisions listed, it would not come as a surprise to any of you that very few have what we can define as a pure legal system. The vast majority administer justice through a mix of different systems. 54% rely primarily on civil law. Various traditions, but all traceable back to Roman jus commune. French, Dutch and Spanish varieties are the most common. 32% rely primarily on common law, either British or American flavour, but common law. 12% rely on a fairly even mixture of these two, with variable predominance. Only 4 rely completely on indigenous systems. 1, the Holy See, relying on canon law. Now, formally distinct, but in effect, let's face it, it's Roman jus commune. Iran relies fully on Islamic law, both Sharia and secular. Pitcairn Island and Togo are the only system using exclusively indigenous or local customary law. There's one missing out of the 254, and it's Libya, described today as its post-revolution legal system is in flux and driven by state and non-state entities, end quote. It's actually better than last year. Last year it says, Libya has no law in effect at this moment. Of all the ones listed above, 11% include elements of Islamic law. But only Iran relies exclusively on it, because even Saudi Arabia relies in part on French civil law. So what I would like to argue is that for global history framework, this tripartite long-term mutual engagement between legal systems is probably what makes the Mediterranean truly unique. I see a smile and holding breath. How can we make a global history which is based on hard evidence? How can we make a global history in which the issue of translation is not merely a problem between languages, but it's a problem between cultures? And let me add that when one translates the law, the problem is tenfold. One of the great strengths of at least the two legal systems I know about properly, which are the civil and the common, have got an uncanny ability of picking up words of common usage and give it particularly precise meanings. And this is a problem that is evident in any newspaper that you might have read today. The simplification of legal terminology, even within the same linguistic base. So, for me, and I'm not a global historian proper, I'm not sure what I am. I now go back to the old nomiker of being an early modernist, because problematic as it is, I suppose it defines me better than other elements. What is important is that, contrary to what my mentors and the creators of microhistory have stated, microhistory is not at all dedicated to the small. Microhistory just tries to root in the extant evidence of practice, historical development. An awful lot of what has been discussed about global history or even European expansion has been discussed on either purely quantitative data or normative type of evidence. The social type of evidence has been neglected in great part. Moving towards overcoming that, this network in itself, evidence of this, but still not at critical mass. The problem, for me, is not so much about the expansion of European laws across the globe per se, which I think is undeniable. More the fact that the European epistemological approach to the administration of justice and the creation of the law as embodiment of authority was imposed wherever European arrived and settled, regardless of mode of conquest or justification employed to support these claims. So the real dangerous element is the fact that the economy and the economic expansion, the economic hegemony, is utterly secondary, in my opinion, in its importance to this legal expansion. International law is built on a European template, and only in the last few decades, alternative legal systems, and I mean the most famous of course is Sharia, but not exclusively, have started to expand again and contrast this epistemological hegemony of European conceptions. I'm thinking of the work of Anthony Anghie here, Mark Mezower, Anver Eamon. But the practical modalities of this phenomenon of cultural expansions are all there still to be properly investigated. And here the issue of scale of analysis takes center stage. The Mediterranean centuries-long interaction is good, and it's doable because it's a small region. It's handleable. And the problem is that a global approach can be done on micro-studies. Global goes well beyond geographic, and micro-history goes well beyond local. Hey, Uncle Freud, jumping in. But I'm not sure that these 2 points have been properly digested in the secondary literature, though varieties of the latter approach are increasingly present in global narratives. These rarely are analyses. In a review article on the relationship between world history and maritime history, and I'm quoting him because he doesn't actually distinguish between the two, so he actually thinks it's global, Michael Pearson argued that some oceans are much more susceptible to world history approach than others. He goes further and argues that, and I quote, "One could argue that giving the Mediterranean, which after all is only a sea, equal status with the great free oceans, is a survival vestige of Orientalism. Just because it was the cradle of Western civilization does not have to mean that it receives as much attention as, say, the much bigger and older Indian Ocean." End quote. I'm not sure what he means by older. If anyone can tell me, it's intriguing. There has been a moment in which the Mediterranean dried up, around 300,000 years ago. But size, per se, is not hierarchically at the top amongst analytical categories, or at least that's what I was trained. It just presents scholars with alternative modalities of research methodologies. In this particular case, I would also argue that it's not clear to me how this distinction can have value. As far as I'm aware, in strictly legal terms, and I'm quoting UN Clause 1982, does not recognize oceans as separate units of analysis. Term used is seas, territorial seas, as opposed to high seas. Scale matters in how we handle the methodology, going back to the microhistorical point. But scale, of course, is also connected with another big elephant in the room of global history: geography. Our discipline, particularly, I hasten to add, in its Anglo-American incarnation, has been plagued by a constant obsession, and I quote, not to revive or condone geographical determinism, end quote. Can we get over this, please? I'm probably preaching to the converted in the fact that we should liberate ourselves from one of the myths of Anglo-American self-representation, which is the abhorrence for anything which appears to limit human agency. Human agency is limited by geographical constraints, amongst many other things. And human agency genius has precisely been in trying to overcome it. Taming the global waters played a fundamental role in this process. Expanding one's own legal Weltanschauung plays the same role. The magnitude of the success of civil and common law in colonizing the globe has fostered a general impression, also amongst us, scholars of Europe, that Europe and the West perfectly overlap, that the West was one, and that there was no possible alternative to what happened, as the shape and form of the present global economy is built on the foundation of early modern, European, scare quotes this time, commercial imperialism. This, buttressed by the triumph, objective triumph of the Industrial Revolution, triumph for some, I hasten to add. Well, it's always for some. And the subsequent global expansion of the British Empire in the 19th century has contributed effectively to a flattening of the European experience within the fold of the Anglo-American dominated 19th and 20th century. Historiography has followed suit, either consciously or subconsciously. But there were alternatives. There are fundamental differences. The resurgence of Islamic law across the globe today is in itself evidence of the long-term survival of alternative ways of conceiving the legal epistemic framework and socio-political structure of societies. The problem, and it's a problem for people that believe in lex mercatoria or lex maritima, is that law is a fundamental tool of expressing identity. And the current British debate on the different nature of the law's and legal system compared to that of Europe is daily unfolding and proving to be the most thorny, politically and culturally sensitive element of the present negotiations between the UK government and the EU. And frankly, blazing evidence of the resilience and relevance of these issues over the longue durée. I wish it was not the case. But again, there are three systems, one globe, which ultimately I think can be discussed also as a true Mediterranean history that became global history. Thank you.